Is it possible to build the common good with money? Before I do anything else, I want to address what I think the question means, because I think we need to address some semantic issues. So firstly, what do we mean by money? Well, normally we mean this stuff. And we certainly can't build the common good out of currency. Money facilitates the purchase of real goods and services and has no value of itself. Perhaps it could be used in some circumstances to wallpaper a room or to decorate a pub, but in general it's totally useless except for the things with which the things you can buy with it, the material things you can buy with it. But I also don't think that the question means that either. In other words, can we build a common good out of what money can buy? The preamble which I read before formulating my talk was really about whether or not we could build a common good out of finance, and that's what I want to talk about. So firstly, let me say that I think it's very difficult to promote human flourishing for all without a financial sector. What does finance do? For the most part, it intermediates. It ensures that I can save for a rainy day, I can insure against risks, provide for my family in retirement, and so on, reasonably cheaply and reasonably safely. It's a bit like a supermarket performs the same sort of function, really. It enables me to buy food reasonably cheaply, reduces transactions costs. I don't have to go to a spinach farmer to buy spinach and a sheep farmer to buy lamb. I could just buy it all in one place. Now, you might think that the financial crisis proved that not to be true, but the financial crisis, I think, was really the exception that proved the rule. Without well-functioning banks, pension companies, unit trust managers, and so on, households would have to search for reliable businesses that required capital. Without liquid deposits in banks or securities markets, people would not be able to cash in their investments, and people would not be able to spread their risks over literally thousands of investment projects. All their eggs would be in one or two baskets if you actually had no intermediating functions of financial institutions at all. And it really is quite simple. Without a sophisticated financial system, all but the very rich would simply rely on friends and family in times of distress and old age. In fact, there's quite a lot to be said for systems of family and fraternal support in times of need, in times of distress, in times of old age. But if they are the only means of support, then there'll be a lot of people who will be left in destitution. The widows and the orphans mentioned several times in the Bible, just to give one example. So I would argue that we actually undervalue the financial sector. People often argue that the financial sector is important only insofar as it provides capital to what is often called the real economy. That is simply not true. The financial sector is important for the services it provides to households. Jobs in the financial sector are socially useful. Indeed, they are essential. So that perhaps leaves me with three questions which in the rest of the time I want to deal with. First of all, and I'll answer them in reverse order, but the first question is the financial sector perhaps a den of self-serving thieves which needs regulating? Secondly, would it be better if we had a sort of more human, some might say more social financial sector or set of financial institutions? And thirdly, would it be better if the financial sector were smaller? So let me answer those questions in reverse order. So people argue that the financial sector in the UK is too big. Apparently we should make more stuff and stop selling each other services. We should be more like Northern Italy or more like Germany. People say that a financial sector that is too big leads to greater inequality and leads the tail of the financial sector to wag the dog of the real economy. None of this is true. The largest financial sectors in the world, as a proportion of national income in normal countries, so excluding places like Luxembourg or Liechtenstein, are to be found in Australia, Holland, and the UK, in that order. For some reason, the OECD doesn't provide comparable data for Switzerland, but that may be the biggest, in fact. Now, those three countries are very different in terms of their levels of inequality and in terms of their culture and in very many ways. And they all, it should be said, are pretty decent places to live. Even in the UK, the financial sector only accounts for 8% of national income. In other words, 92% of the economy is doing stuff other than providing financial services. Not only that, 1/3 of the output of the UK financial sector is exported to other countries to allow us to buy things, manufactured goods and other services. So only around 5% of the UK economy is actually producing domestically consumed financial services. And there is another crucial point. I hear all the time that our economy would be better if it were more like Germany's economy. It wouldn't. Beneficial trade relies on countries being different, not being similar. It really is important for both the UK economy and the German economy that they specialise in different things and don't simply try to imitate each other. And indeed, we often beat ourselves up about the performance of our economy relative to Germany, but this is just a hangover from the 1970s. Our recent economic performance is almost identical to that of Germany, whether you measure that by national income, the proportion of people in poverty, consumption levels, or the level of unemployment, or a whole load of other variables. So I reject entirely the argument that the financial sector in the UK is too big, the tail wagging the dog sort of argument. Is the financial sector perhaps not human enough? Well, here I think the critics of the financial sector do have a point, but I wouldn't necessarily reach the same conclusions in relation to what we should do about it. Would the common good perhaps be better promoted if we had more financial institutions that were rooted in the community, more mutual finance, and so on? People lament the loss of the old building societies or trustee savings banks, friendly societies, mutual insurance companies. Adair Turner called for bank managers that were more like Captain Mannering and less like those that we have in the banks of today. Now, this is a pretty complicated story to unpick. I think there's a tendency for people to look back with rose-tinted spectacles. Yes, there may have been certain advantages of a model where the bank manager played golf and went to the Rotary Club with all the local business owners, and the city was still a tight-knit network. However, it was a more exclusive place. There was more of what political economists call bonding social capital, but rather less of what political economists called bridging social capital between different groups in society. The city, it should be said, in the UK was a rather more open financial centre than in other countries, but nevertheless it was still a pretty exclusive place. And actually, just let me illustrate that with one story. I wrote the foreword on behalf of Eddie George, the former Governor of the Bank of England, to the history of the Foreign and Colonial Investment Trust. If any of you bought the book on the grounds that Eddie George wrote the foreword, I'm sorry you've been conned. I actually wrote it for him. And in that book, it was a very pleasurable couple of days at the Bank of England reading it, and in that book it talked about how the Foreign and Colonial revolutionised its recruitment practices in 1965. And before 1965, the Foreign and Colonial had simply employed relatives of, or in senior positions, employed relatives of people in general who already worked there. And in 1965, this was revolutionised. The personnel manager rang up an old friend at Oxford, who happened to be in charge of careers at his old Oxford college, and asked him if he had any decent chaps, and they were chaps, I can assure you, decent chaps who might make good employees of the Foreign and Colonial. So this was a great opening up of the city, from relatives of people who already worked in the company to friends of people who already worked in the company. And things are very different now, and I think it's good that they are. Secondly, the very diverse range of financial institutions that existed at the beginning of the 20th century, 7 million members of friendly societies, an incredible 645 trustee savings banks rooted in the local community in 1861, dozens, I think 62, mutual insurance companies, and so on, was essentially destroyed by government action. This was no inevitable process of market centralisation. The functions of the friendly societies were quite deliberately taken over by government, and eventually the Trustees' Savings Bank was turned into a PLC by Act of Parliament, nationalised and then privatised. And there is a wealth of evidence that the hugely increased regulation of the financial sector removed the need for, or in economist language, removed the comparative advantage of these community-based institutions. The comparative advantage of a mutual insurer, for example, was that it regulated really quite well conflicts of interest between customers and owners. But when these things are regulated by state regulators, as happened after 1988, the fact that mutuals tend to be technically inefficient and it's more difficult for them to raise capital means that they had no chance of surviving. The government actually essentially took over the function of mutual insurance companies of being able to regulate these conflicts of interest. The comparative advantage of trustees' savings banks and building societies was that they were safer for depositors. The former had to invest in treasury bills and the latter had a trade body which required them to keep very large amounts of capital. When the EU forced Britain to introduce deposit insurance in 1979, and then banks had minimum capital requirements imposed upon them by government, why would anybody use a bank that did not pay the highest rate of interest? Technical efficiency would win the day rather than these other rather subtle advantages that these community institutions got involved with. So that before the state got involved in finance, which in the UK really happened from the 1980s onwards, there was a really rich tapestry of financial institutions in Britain. Many institutions had unlimited liability, others had double liability for shareholders. There are certainly certain advantages of the more uniform scene that we see today. It certainly serves us well, but I think there are lessons that we can learn from the past if we actually want to make finance more human. So finally, is finance a den of thieves? Well, maybe so. Human imperfection is a fact. That's an exaggeration. Human imperfection is a fact of life. The fast-moving activity of finance is no doubt likely to attract a decent proportion of dodgy people, just in the same way that houses attract a fair proportion of burglars. But just as it's better to have houses than not have houses, it's better to have a financial system than not have a financial system. And indeed, I believe in a market economy, partly because ultimately a business must serve its customers, however nasty or incompetent those at the top are, if it is to survive. We shouldn't judge a market against perfection, but really against the range of other alternatives that are available, given the imperfectibility of the human person. However, and this goes back and relates to my previous point, if the state bails out financial institutions, it's not going to make them any more ethical or any more careful. Why does Lloyds, for example, Lloyds Bank, need to promote a reputation for fair dealing when the government regulates these things? Why does Barclays, originally a Quaker institution like Friends Provident and many others, need to promote a reputation for prudence when the government regulates its capital and gives its customers deposit insurance? A financial institution should be a common endeavour of owners and workers serving customers and through that serving wider society. And a financial institution should look outwards towards its customers and in doing so look outwards towards its society, all those businesses and households that are customers of the institution. It shouldn't be looking Canary Wharfwards to the regulators. And we have hugely increased financial regulation over the last 3 decades. This didn't stop the crash, and I believe it has made the financial sector more self-serving by, as I think Vince Cable suggested, nationalising losses whilst allowing profits still to be privatised. Or as I once put it, creating essentially a welfare state for bankers. So to conclude, finance contributes to the common good. it would be impossible to imagine a society operating at any reasonable level of human flourishing without a well-functioning financial sector. But of course, we cannot build the common good on finance alone. And indeed, the common good itself is not simply about material flourishing. It's about much more than that, including spiritual and other aspects of human flourishing. I think finance is more valuable than we think, but we've probably made it less human than it once was. And I really do believe that government intervention is a particular problem here. And hopefully, as new forms of finance come along, perhaps they can both transcend the existing government regulatory model as well as transcending some of these existing financial institutions which perhaps have become rather too large, uniform and to some extent self-serving. And I think with developments in technology that may well happen as long as the regulators keep their fingers out of it. But let's not compare finance and the financial system that we have against perfection. After all, we don't compare the government against perfection. We don't compare any other institution against perfection. And indeed, we don't even compare the institutions of the church against perfection. We should compare it against the range of alternatives that are realistically available. And I think a world with a much smaller financial sector and a Britain with a much smaller financial sector would be a much poorer place in more ways than one.